WDIA radio station, Memphis, June 18, 1956. Program director Bob Alberti holds a telegram that will change the course of American music history forever. The message, sent by the National Association of Radio Broadcasters, is simple and devastating. Effective immediately, all member stations are strongly advised to cease playing recordings by Elvis Presley, music deemed detrimental to American youth morals. Within 24 hours, more than 50 radio stations across America will remove Elvis Presley from their playlists. The king of rock and roll at the peak of his early success will suddenly find his voice silenced across much of the country that made him famous. But this isn't just about one singer or one song. This is about the moment when America's cultural establishment decided that rock and roll had gone too far, that Elvis Presley represented a threat to social order that had to be stopped before it could spread any further. What follows will be one of the most intense censorship battles in American entertainment history, a war between the old guard trying to preserve traditional values and a new generation demanding the right to hear the music that spoke to their hearts. This is the story of how America tried to silence Elvis Presley, the shocking tactics used to destroy his career, and the cultural revolution that refused to be stopped. The campaign to ban Elvis from American radio didn't happen overnight. It was the result of months of mounting pressure from religious leaders, parent organizations, and cultural conservatives who saw Elvis as the embodiment of everything that was going wrong with American youth. The opposition began in earnest after Elvis's appearances on television in early 1956. The sight of a young man moving his hips in ways that suggested sexuality, combined with music that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to physical impulses, triggered a moral panic that spread across the country like wildfire. Dr. Francis Braceland, a prominent psychiatrist and spokesperson for traditional values, published an article in the Saturday Review that became the intellectual foundation for the anti-Elvis movement. This Presley phenomenon, he wrote, represents a regression to primitive behavior patterns that civilized society has worked centuries to overcome. His performances are nothing short of obscene exhibitions that corrupt the natural development of American teenagers. The article was reprinted in newspapers across the country and became required reading for parent-teacher associations, church groups, and civic organizations that were searching for ways to articulate their discomfort with the cultural changes they saw happening around them. But it was the formation of the Committee for Decent Music that transformed scattered opposition into organized warfare against Elvis and rock and roll. Led by Reverend Albert Carter of the Southern Baptist Convention and Dr. Margaret Walsh of the National Congress of Parents and Teachers, the committee represented a coalition of religious, educational, and civic groups united by their belief that rock and roll music posed a direct threat to American moral standards. The committee's strategy was sophisticated and deadly effective. Instead of attacking Elvis directly, which might have generated sympathy for him as a victim of censorship, they focused on the radio stations that played his music, applying pressure where it would be most economically devastating. "We're not trying to suppress free speech," Reverend Carter explained at the committee's founding press conference. "We're simply asking radio stations to consider their responsibility to the communities they serve. Do they want to be remembered as the stations that corrupted an entire generation of American children?" The pressure campaign began with letter-writing efforts that flooded radio stations with complaints about Elvis's music. But these weren't random protests from individual listeners. The Committee for Decent Music had created template letters that could be customized and distributed through church networks, school systems, and civic organizations across the country. The economic pressure was immediate and devastating. Radio stations that had been profiting from the popularity of rock and roll suddenly found themselves facing a choice between advertising revenue and musical programming. For most station owners, the choice was obvious. The announcement triggered a domino effect that spread across the country with shocking speed. Within 2 weeks of WMID's ban, stations in Boston, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Denver, and Los Angeles had implemented similar policies. But the most devastating blow came when the National Association of Radio Broadcasters, the industry's primary trade organization, issued its advisory recommending that member stations discontinue playing Elvis's recordings. While technically non-binding, the advisory carried enormous weight with station owners who depended on the association for industry support and regulatory guidance. The advisory was carefully worded to avoid obvious censorship language, but its intent was unmistakable. Member stations are reminded of their responsibility to serve the public interest and maintain community standards. Programming decisions should reflect the wholesome values that define American broadcasting. Elvis's management team, led by Colonel Tom Parker, initially underestimated the scope and organization of the opposition they were facing. Parker's first response was to dismiss the bans as publicity stunts that would ultimately help Elvis by making him seem more rebellious and exciting. "Any publicity is good publicity," Parker told reporters. "These stations that are banning Elvis are just giving him more attention. Their listeners are going to find ways to hear his music whether they play it or not." But as the ban spread and Elvis's record sales began to decline in markets where his music was no longer being played, Parker realized that his client was facing an existential threat to his career. The committee's strategy was working. By removing Elvis from the airwaves, they were making it impossible for him to maintain the connection with audiences that had made him a star. The response from Elvis's fans was immediate and passionate. Teenagers across the country organized protests outside radio stations that had banned his music. In Detroit, more than 500 high school students marched in front of WXYZ carrying signs reading, "Free Elvis" and "Music is our right." But the most effective counterattack came from an unexpected source: economics. While the Committee for Decent Music had succeeded in pressuring many stations to ban Elvis, they hadn't considered the market forces that had made his music popular in the first place. Stations that continued to play Elvis's music found themselves gaining listeners and advertising revenue as young people sought out the few sources where they could still hear rock and roll. WLAC in Nashville, which refused to join the ban, saw its teenage audience share double within a month. More importantly, the controversy itself became a news story that kept Elvis in the public eye even when his music wasn't being played. Every newspaper article about the radio bans mentioned Elvis's name, and every television discussion of the censorship controversy included clips of his performances. The tide began to turn when several prominent cultural figures spoke out against the censorship campaign. Jazz legend Louis Armstrong issued a statement defending Elvis's right to perform. "That boy's got talent, and America's supposed to be the land of the free. If we start telling people what music they can and can't play, where does it stop?" Even more influential was the support Elvis received from established entertainers who had initially been skeptical of rock and roll. Perry Como, one of the smoothest and most respected crooners of the era, told reporters, "I may not understand Elvis's music, but I understand American values. Censorship is not one of them." But the real breakthrough came when Elvis himself finally addressed the controversy directly. In a carefully crafted statement released through his publicist, Elvis appealed not to teenage rebellion but to American ideals of fairness and freedom. "I've never tried to corrupt anybody or hurt anybody with my music. I sing the songs I feel, and if that moves people, I'm grateful. But I believe in America's promise that everyone has the right to be heard, and I believe in the intelligence of American people to make their own decisions about what they want to listen to." The statement, with its appeal to patriotic values and personal freedom, reframed the controversy in ways that made the censorship campaign appear un-American rather than protective of American values. The beginning of the end for the radio bans came when several major market stations began quietly adding Elvis's music back to their playlists. The economic pressure from advertisers who wanted to reach teenage audiences, combined with listener demands and the negative publicity associated with censorship, made the bans increasingly difficult to maintain. By December 1956, most of the stations that had banned Elvis's music had quietly reversed their policies. The Committee for Decent Music, which had seemed so powerful just months earlier, found its influence rapidly declining as the American public demonstrated that it was not willing to accept censorship of popular music. The radio war revealed something crucial about American culture in the 1950s. While the establishment could organize effective opposition to cultural change, they could not ultimately control what young people wanted to hear. The market forces that had made Elvis successful in the first place proved stronger than the moral pressures that had temporarily silenced him. But the victory came at a cost. The censorship controversy had demonstrated the power of organized opposition to rock and roll, and it established a template for cultural conservatives who wanted to control popular music. Similar campaigns would be launched against other rock and roll artists throughout the 1950s and 1960s, creating a pattern of moral panic and censorship that would define the relationship between popular music and cultural authority for decades. For Elvis personally, the radio ban controversy became a defining experience that shaped his understanding of his role as a cultural figure. The knowledge that his music could generate such passionate opposition made him more aware of his influence and more careful about how he used it. In later interviews, Elvis would describe the radio bans as the moment he realized he was more than just an entertainer. "I learned that my music meant something important to people, important enough that some folks wanted to stop other folks from hearing it. That's when I knew I had a responsibility that went beyond just singing songs." The Committee for Decent Music eventually disbanded in early 1957, its mission abandoned as rock and roll became an established part of American culture. Reverend Carter and Dr. Walsh had succeeded in creating a brief moment of organized opposition to cultural change, but they had failed to prevent the changes they feared. The radio stations that had banned Elvis found themselves having to acknowledge that they had been on the wrong side of history. Several station managers issued public apologies for their censorship policies, admitting that they had been pressured into decisions that violated their commitment to serving their listeners. Bob Alberti, the Memphis program director who had received the original advisory to ban Elvis, later reflected on the controversy with evident regret. "We let fear override our judgment. Elvis's music wasn't dangerous, it was just different. And different isn't the same as wrong." The radio war of 1956 became a defining moment in the history of American popular music and free speech. It demonstrated that cultural censorship, even when organized and well-funded, could not ultimately stop artistic expression that resonated with large segments of the American public. But perhaps most importantly, the controversy established Elvis Presley as more than just a musical performer. By surviving the most intense censorship campaign ever launched against a popular musician, Elvis proved that rock and roll was not a passing fad, but a permanent part of American culture. The establishment had tried to silence the king, and the king had refused to be silenced. In the process, he had won something more valuable than commercial success. He had won the right for rock and roll to exist as a legitimate form of American artistic expression. The day America tried to silence Elvis Presley became the day America learned that some voices are too powerful to be stopped by fear, prejudice, or organized opposition. The king had spoken, and America eventually had learned to listen.